Frayed Feathers explains, what is reconciliation to young Indigenous people in Canada? This video will be broken down into 3 sections. Firstly, what is reconciliation? How did we get here? And how does it relate to young Indigenous people? Let's jump into section 1. Firstly, the Canadian definition of reconciliation is It looks like we've got a friend for the rest of our video. Firstly, the Canadian definition of reconciliation is building a renewed relationship with Indigenous people based on the recognition of rights, respect, and partnership. And for Canada, Indigenous people means First Nations, Métis, and Inuit identities. But it begs the question, why is there a need for a renewed relationship? Well, between the years of 1831 and 1996, the Government of Canada sponsored Christian churches to operate residential schools as a way to assimilate Indigenous youth into Canadian society. Assimilation from a colonial perspective means to absorb one community or one culture into another one. The goal was to enforce a Eurocentric lifestyle upon Indigenous youth by teaching them trades and religion. However, these schools solely focused on assimilation practices and had little to no regard of the lasting effects that some of these practices would have on people. The reality for Indigenous students of these residential schools is that they were forcibly removed from their homes and separated from their siblings, stripped of their traditional names, clothing, and given a new haircut, forbidden to speak their first language, even in letters home. They were given new names and forced to practice Christianity. Until the 1950s, residential schools operated on a half-day system, meaning only half a student's day was learning while the rest was physical labor, mostly to operate the school inexpensively. Disobedience to these rules were met with horrific acts of violence and abuse. Of the 150,000 students who attended the 130 schools between 1831 and 1996, 6,000 children died. Now at Frayed Feathers, my focus is the present and the future. It's not my goal to make you feel uncomfortable by hearing this information, but rather empowering you with the knowledge to ensure that history does not repeat itself. If you'd like to learn more about residential schools, over 6,000 recorded testimonies of witnesses in the description. I'd like to offer you a story, and it's about this braid right here. You see, as an Indigenous person, my teachings is that my hair is an extension of myself, in that all my hardships, victories, lessons, traumas are captured in this strand right here. And one of the biggest reasons why I would decide to cut my hair is when I'm in mourning. You see, when we go through hard things in our life, sometimes it's easier to let go and to rebuild ourselves. And so cutting hair can be very symbolic. In the example that is most common, I feel, is that whenever a beloved friend or family passes away, and we cut our hair and we either bury it with their body or burn it with their body as a way to keep us connected. I am giving a part of myself, part of my hardships, traumas, and victories to this person that is now entering the spirit world. For me, my hair means a lot to me. It's symbolic of so many things, one of which being how prosperous my life and family is right now. What a privilege it is to have long hair and not be mourning through the loss of a beloved family member or friend. In these few short minutes, I've conveyed to you how special my hair is to me, and from an Indigenous perspective, the cultural significance that this has. And yet, residential schools enforced haircuts for all Indigenous children entering. And so I feel this story is a microcosm to illustrate how little the Government of Canada engaged and cared to hear about the Indigenous perspective before developing residential schools that had such large ramifications on the community. Since then, the Government of Canada has recognized the atrocities committed to Indigenous people during residential schools, and to reconcile these relationships, the government created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, otherwise known as the TRC. Between 2007 and 2015, the TRC was provided $72 million to support their engagement with more than 6,500 witnesses across Canada, with the goal that the TRC would create a historical record of the residential school system. In June 2015, the TRC hosted its closing event in Ottawa, Ontario, by presenting a final report including 94 calls to action to further reconciliation between Canadian and Indigenous peoples. If we look at the TRC calls to action, we can see that Indigenous youth have a very clear call in number 66. It reads, "We call the federal government to establish multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations to deliver programs on reconciliation and establish a national network to share information and best practices." In August 2017, the Honorable Carolyn Bennett, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, appointed 3 youth advisors, Andre Baer, Gabrielle Fayant, and Matali Okalik, to gather insights, feedback, and ideas with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit youth across Canada. A summation of all these engagements is captured in a report called Indigenous Youth Voices, a Roadmap to Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action number 66. From this report, the Government of Canada launched a 3-year pilot project in partnership with the Canadian Roots Exchange to reconcile the relationship of Crown Indigenous relations to Indigenous youth. In a future video, we'll go over the details of implementation leading up to this point. But for now, you've learned a lot in this video, and thank you so much for making it this far. My call to action for you today is to commit to an exercise that I've developed. Every Monday when we see each other, I'm going to give you a new exercise to build upon the last. And so by the end of it, we're going to build this great vision of how you, any person who's watching this, can action on reconciliation to young Indigenous people in Canada. So here it is. If a group of young Indigenous people approached you and asked you to teach them something, what would you teach them? I want you to write down 5 things and pick your favorite. I want to emphasize that this does not need to be a high-level skill. It can be anything within your expertise, and it can even be fun too. Some examples might include managing money, writing reports, driving lessons, operating heavy equipment, baking the best batch of cookies in the world, or negotiating. As a Canadian citizen, it's all of our responsibility to action on reconciliation, no matter how big or small. And so I thank you for taking this step with me today. Miigwech. Just one last thing before I go. Tomorrow, there's going to be a podcast released on this channel. Just a long-form video, more talking about all the things that didn't make it into the video, going a little bit more into my personal experiences with these things, and overall just kind of talking about what Frayed Feathers does and how we action on reconciliation for young people in Canada. So, if you'd like to see some of that, please subscribe, and I'll catch you tomorrow.